You've written the book, Networking for Introverts, but you're not an introvert.
What I've observed that extroverts were in fact not the best networkers. It is in fact often the introverts. So that epiphany led me on a research journey where I interviewed 253 introverts because I wanted to prove the theory. And what I found out is that is actually true. Introverts are better networkers than extroverts if
Helen Nicholson, best known as the Networking Queen, is the founder of The Networking Company, a best-selling author, global entrepreneur, and passionate connector, helping professionals master the essential power skills for success.
He's an introvert and I'm an extrovert, and I could see at the beginning of the event he'd already had enough. And I realized then it actually wasn't a choice. It is his brain was literally full. When an introvert arrives at an event, their dopamine cup is already quite full, whereas extroverts have actually got less dopamine receptors in their brain. And that means if you want to feel satisfied and fulfilled at the end of the evening, we've got to fill up our dopamine cup. You've got someone who can help sort out that problem, then connect them. Because that's where you start to become a power broker. A mindset that's been very helpful to me has been to realize that no one is coming to rescue you.
Welcome back to the Sparks by Ignium podcast. I am Phil Rose and I'm the host of the show. And today I'm delighted to welcome Helen Nicholson to the show. Helen and I met through Strategic Coach, which we're part of in London. And I really became interested in Helen's ideas around networking for introverts. And we'll tell you more about that as we go. But Helen Nicholson is the founder and CEO of The Networking Company. She specializes in speaking and teaching people to develop powerful personal brands and networks all over the world. And actually, she does a lot of work around mindful resilience, which in her words has helped thousands of individuals overcome burnout. She's written that book all about mindfulness and how to stay sane in an insane world, and also the book around networking for introverts, which we'll talk about as we go. So Helen, welcome to the Sparks by Ignium podcast.
It's wonderful to be here.
Thanks, Helen. Now, I know we talked recently about some of the stories we want to talk about today, and I'm delighted because there's so much more to you that I didn't know to start with. And I'm really looking forward to delving into some of these things around what it means. And the first one I want to ask is very much around, you've written the book, Networking for Introverts, but you're not an introvert. I'd love to start there. Tell me about that.
So, I've been involved in leadership development training work for the last 18 years. And what I've observed, we do a lot of work in financial services and in the legal field and actuarial. And in those fields, there are a lot of introverts. And I've always had a special place in my heart for the people who come up to me at the end of a talk or a training session. And you can see that they really battle with this skill. Mm-hmm. And so I saw the real struggle that was real for, and they felt that they weren't recognized. They felt that their contributions weren't seen. And there was consistent feedback I got. And then alongside that, I have been studying good networking and what is best practice and who are the people who do this best. And if you look at best practice networking, it's often around the people who listen well and people who follow up. And then I kind of thought to myself, well, as an extrovert and as someone who's a natural extrovert, I often battle with listening because I get too excited about wanting to share, whatever I'm thinking about. Yeah. And often I get excited about the interaction and then I don't follow up. And I realized then that extroverts were in fact not the best networkers. It is in fact often the introverts. So that epiphany led me on a research journey where I interviewed 253 introverts because I wanted to prove the theory. And what I found out is that is actually true. Introverts are better networkers than extroverts and that if is a big if you get certain things right. And it's around leaning into their natural strengths and putting themselves out there, but also realizing that they can build a very effective network one coffee at a time. I think there's a perception that networking only happens at big functions, at the big conference or the big cocktail party. And that is not introverts' happy spaces. They often have to do it. And I always say to people, if you go to an event and you meet 3 people and you follow up with those 3 people and you connect meaningfully with them, then you can go home. So, introverts, because their energy is finite, I always say to them, make sure you arrive at the function early, meet your 3 people quickly, and then you can go home. And they were quite relieved about that piece of feedback.
Yeah, and I love that in the sense that we'll come on to this later on in terms of the science around it. But I love that fact that extroverts aren't the best networkers because what you said there, the best practice is listening and following up. And sometimes the extroverts don't do either of those well.
No.
It's all about them probably, and they don't then bother following up because they don't think about it.
No. You see, I think, we've got quite an old-fashioned view of what a good networker looks like. I think if you go to a room and you see the person who's air kissing lots of people and looks like they're working the room, often people will look at that person and say like, wow, that's good networking. But in actual fact, that is not meaningfully connecting with people. And I think the new style of networking is around those authentic, meaningful connections.
Yeah. And the word I'm hearing there is about, effective networking is about meaningful connections, and therefore you build them deep. And I love your phrase there, building the network one coffee at a time.
Yes.
That's
It
interesting.
doesn't have to be just done at big events. Big
Yeah.
events play a role because it's where you almost get your network gets filled up, it gets refreshed, and you often have an opportunity then to meet a significant amount of new people in quite a short space of time, especially if it's an industry event. But if you have a strategy where you are going to have a coffee, and I would recommend 2 a week. If you have coffee, if for example you're in a corporate, you have 1 coffee with someone internally and 1 coffee with someone externally every week, then by the end of a year you will have a very, very strong network.
Wow.
Especially if you have a keeping in touch strategy with those people.
Yeah. And I love that, isn't it? Because effectively by doing just that, you're potentially having up to 52 internal and up to 52 external conversations per year, just on that one per week. So you're building up that network slowly, but you're actually building depth in it as well.
Indeed. And you don't always have to have coffees with the different people all the time.
Okay. Yes.
If you identify the connectors, and connectors are very powerful people in networks. And I have built our business around a connector. And the way in which you find out whether someone is a connector or not is, you'll try and find something that you have in common. So say, for example, Phil, you and I arrive at an event together, and I see we drive the same brand of car.
Okay.
And I'll say to you, Phil, I'm new in London and I see we drive the same brand of car. Where do you recommend I get my car serviced?
Okay.
And if you're a connector, then you'll be sending me the details of the garage that you take your car to, and you'll be saying, tell them that Phil sent you. And that's the sentence that indicates that you are probably a connector. So connectors are, professional matchmakers, recruiters. They are people who charge a fee for being a connector. They are taking a need and they're taking a person and they're connecting those 2 things together.
Okay.
And it's a very powerful skill. And I always say to people, even if you're not a connector, start acting as a connector, because people talk about their problems. And when someone that speaks about a problem and you've got someone who can help sort out that problem, then connect them. Because that's where you start to become a power broker in a network versus a participant. You start becoming, a lot more important than, just the average person in a network.
I love that. And I love that thing about that power broker and that tell them Phil sent you, because there's a connection there, isn't it? Because you're connecting both ways. You're connecting to the new person, Helen, I drive this car, go and talk to them. But also you're connecting back to the person you're sending them to, who are saying, Phil's thinking of me as well. So that double connection coming about because of that.
And I bet you if you went to that garage and you say to them, I bet you Phil has sent them probably 20 or 30 of their clients over the years, because that's what connectors do. But one of the things that I always say, the big disclaimer or the big way to manage your connectors effectively is you've got to have eyeball-to-eyeball contact with them. They're interestingly enough not good on email. They're quite transactional on the phone. They still like building relationships eyeball to eyeball. And so if you haven't seen a connector, I always get people to audit their networks, and I'll share the QR code with anyone who's listening or watching this, where you can actually go and audit your network and see who those power brokers are. And then the next question I would always say to them is, when last did you see that person? Because if you haven't seen a connector within the last 6 months, then they probably have forgotten about you. So you've got to have a keep in touch, preferably eyeball to eyeball, coffee, lunch, breakfast, drinks strategy with your connectors. Because in my view, they're to the power of 100. And not everyone is a connector. I think maybe 1 in 100.
Wow, that's
So
fascinating.
they are quite rare, and that's why you've got to treat them very carefully and intentionally.
I love that. So you mentioned something about eyeball to eyeball, and I think there's something that came up to me. We're recording this now in April 2025. 5 years ago, the world went into lockdown and people couldn't do that face-to-face networking. And I'm thinking about some of the networking groups that I continued with. We set up, and like everyone did, we had our virtual networking rooms, and
Yeah.
everyone went on board to do it, whether it was on Zoom or on Teams or on Google Meet. Um, some of those networks didn't survive COVID. The networks over time, everyone was high on it to start with, and then it diminished over the next year. And some of those
Mm.
networks never picked up again. Um, Interesting, actually. One of my networks may be just about to be rekindled, unfortunately, because one of the members has just died, literally last week. So we've all had a round of WhatsApps going, say we need to get back together again. But it's taken a bit of an impetus to get it going. So I wonder, how do those connectors work with, obviously in that time 5 years ago, and what's been the impact of that change in the world to be more virtual in some cases, and some networks which do their virtual networking?
Yeah, I think connectors took a lot of strain over the COVID hard lockdowns
Mm.
and hybrid work. And one of the best connectors that I know, he has lunch with someone every single day, 5 days a week, and he has built an extraordinarily successful business. But and I said to him, how did you keep in touch with your network when there was COVID and etc.? And he said
Mm.
he launched his own cooking show. I mean, he's not a chef, he's actually an accountant. And his wife would video him cooking, and then he would cook recipes, and then he would send them out to all of his, all the people on his phone. And that was what his keeping in touch strategy was, which was a lot of fun because he actually was not a great cook. And, so it was funny and people laughed, but he kept up his visibility. And
That's
what concerns me is with hybrid work and remote work is I can't tell you the number of meetings I still got onto where people don't have their cameras on, and I say to them, you run the risk of becoming a no-name brand. Just like the only way or the reason why we buy no-name brand products at a supermarket is for a price
Yeah, that's
reason.
interesting.
We don't buy them because they emotional connections. And if visibility is a very important element of brands. If
Yeah.
if you meet someone face to face, 70% of your memory about them will be what they looked like and what they sounded like.
That's
So,
interesting.
if you are not putting your camera on meetings, immediately you are at almost a 70% disadvantage because people are not seeing you. And I
Mm.
do worry about that. I think people have forgotten how important their visibility is in terms of building their brand and their network.
Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because from your perspective, when I think about how I introduced you just now and reading off the bio that you sent me, one thing you put there, and I'm just going back to look at it there, is very much about teaching people to develop teaching people to develop powerful personal brands.
Yeah.
And that comes before the network. So the bit I'm just hearing you saying there is actually the brand comes from being there, but also there's something else about that brand called Phil or that brand called Helen that you have to
Yes.
cultivate and create in the same way we do with a business brand.
Indeed. And, in many ways, my thinking about personal branding has really evolved and gotten deeper over the years because a lot of people think personal branding is quite superficial. They think it's a lot about your look, but ultimately, I actually have a much deeper real experience of it at this stage in my career, where
Okay.
I believe personal branding is actually deeply spiritual. I actually think it's you uncovering your purpose. It's you uncovering what you were put on this planet to do, and then packaging that
Wow.
value in a very powerful way. And then
That's
you communicate that value then through your network.
Yeah.
And that wasn't, 10 or even 5 years ago. I'm not sure I would have thought that. But now, because you find that when people discover their purpose, their personal brand immediately becomes a lot clearer. They realize what's their secret sauce. And we do a lot of work in corporates. And I always say to people, even if you're sitting next to a colleague who's doing exactly the same job as you, and they have the same job description, but the difference is you. It's that
Mm,
secret sauce.
mm,
And
mm.
one of the things that I think gets in the way of people's personal brands is that often we are more in touch with our weaknesses than we are with our strengths. I
Yes.
always say to people, if you were to list your top 5 strengths right here, right now, a lot of people will have difficulty answering that question. Whereas if I say to you, list your top 5 weaknesses, we'll all be able to say them off the bat. So, and that's one of the things that gets in the way, because a good personal brand is built around your strengths, not your weaknesses.
That's interesting. So why is it in that case? Why are we so good at identifying our weaknesses rather than our strengths in the personal branding space? Because that's really interesting. Effectively, that's to our detriment in that case,
Yeah.
because we're not playing the game we need to be playing at our fullest capability.
But I think, one of the things I studied the neuroscience of mindfulness, of happiness, of productivity for both of the books. And one of the epiphanies that I had is that if you leave your brain naturally to do its work, your brain is actually a very negative organ. It's only there for 2 reasons. It's there to help you survive. So
Yeah,
that's why it's constantly searching for danger.
yeah.
And that's why your brain is automatically focusing on what could go wrong. It's not focusing on what could go right, because that's not going to affect your survival. And the second thing, your brain is there to help you think and solve problems. So if you realize that your brain has a natural negative bias, it's the same thing as if any of you got a report or you sit in a performance appraisal. We immediately will go to the worst marks that we got for that exam. We don't go to the best marks, because
Yeah.
our brain is saying, that's a problem. That's getting in the way of your survival. So you must fix that. So I think when we acknowledge the neuroscience of performance, and really realize that we've almost got to train our brain like we would train a muscle. If you wanted,
Mm,
Michelle Obama arms, you would go to gym and you'd start lifting, and you've actually got to train your brain
yeah,
to, and I use things like gratitude, meditation,
yeah.
those kind of tools help your brain. I think they calm it down, and
Yeah.
they also make it focus on, wow, we're actually very blessed and lucky.
I love that. I love that. And interesting, that muscle training piece. I was listening to a piece recently with Dr. Joe Dispenza, and he was talking there about the epigenetic view of the world, and also then think about exactly that we can improve our brain by
Mm.
actively working it. And I love your point there about training it like a muscle, and gratitude, meditation, all of those aspects. And I might come back to talk about that in a minute, because I love that as an approach. Before I ask that question, I want to ask another thing there about let's go back to that point about uncovering your purpose. The key point there is you said this is about packaging it up, and it's your secret source of who you are.
Yeah.
A lot of people have talked about purpose, or they talk about why, and they'll refer to Simon Sinek's book in business, or they'll look at other methods. First question is, what's your purpose?
I
You
was
as
put
in
on this earth to teach. I'm the daughter of a teacher. And when I see the lights go on in people's eyes, and then they say to me, I've got it. I get that. That's what fills my soul. So, doing that through speaking at
Mm,
events and conferences and training people. So, it certainly takes some time. I don't think, I always say to people, I think that you can experiment until maybe the age of 35. My biggest wish for people is that by the time you're 35, you've got some sense of that North Star.
yeah.
Sometimes it's not exactly clear, but you've got an idea. And often to have jobs that you don't like prior to 35 is actually very powerful, because that not liking something gives you clarity about what you do like.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
do a lot of work with graduates, and you'll find a lot of them in their first or second year of work, they'll go, hate this. And then I always say to them, but delve deeper into that dislike. Is it your boss you don't like? Is it the work? Is it the industry? Get specific. about what you don't like, because
Yeah.
that then is giving you clarity around that North Star
Mm.
as to what you do like.
I love that. So the whole other thing there, isn't it? Experiment till you're age 35, because by doing that, you can try things on. And interestingly, that fits in. A friend of mine is um, in fact, he's a very, very good CEO coach. And he often says to me, I don't mind what the CEOs did in their first 10 years after graduation or school. It doesn't
Mm,
matter. It's after
no.
that when they've got to start understanding it. So that really fits in with that thing that Simon tells me. So interesting. Come back to your word, to teach. And I love that for many reasons. One is because I love it's just a simple word.
Mm,
My purpose is the word to inspire.
mm.
And I can tell you the story another day about how that came about. But I love that because I can just connect to it. And there's a whole load of words that sit underneath it. But tell me, for you in that case, to teach, you talked about speaking at events, you said you're a daughter of a teacher. How did you discover that was your purpose, or did your purpose discover you? Because where did it come from?
I think because I originally studied to be an accountant, so clearly it didn't come naturally, especially initially. And I had an aptitude to do that, but I didn't have a love. And I think that the one of the best pieces of advice I got, which I've since paid forward to other people, is follow your envy. Look around you at the people or the friends you have. And I had a friend in our 20s, once I'd qualified as an accountant and was very unhappy in my job. I had a friend who was involved in training. And I looked at her job and I was like, that's something that, and so I started having chats to her about her work. I started going to conferences that they would go to. I started reading what they would read.
Wow.
And then, and then I started to build a network in the training, teaching, facilitation space.
Mm.
And then I got an opportunity. So my network then enables, and that's why your network is so powerful when you're going through a career transition,
Yeah.
because you've almost got to build it. You've got to dig your well before it's empty, and you've got to dig your well where you want to go.
I love that. And I love that dig your well before it's empty. What a great metaphor for life in general, isn't it? In terms of uh, taking the time to be mindful about where you're going before you get there and actually do that pre-planning time in advance.
Yes. You
Love
you
that.
never want to be an SOS networker. I think the SOS networker is the person who you only hear from when they're in trouble. And when you see their name appear on your phone, you almost roll your eyes because that's the only time you hear from that person. And that is not a great brand to have. I always think it's very good to imagine all your relationships as bank accounts. And you always want to have more deposits in
Yes.
those bank accounts than you withdraw, because
Mm.
you always want to offer more value than you extract
Yeah.
value. And
Love
if
that.
you do that, you will have a network that will last you your whole life.
I really love that. And interesting, actually, that resonates so much. And I know, I don't know where you picked that from, but I love that because Stephen Covey used to talk about this around making deposits in the emotional bank account. And to
Mhm.
me, that you've just articulated it so well. Those networkers who ring you when they're in need are not the
Mm,
ones you want to be working with because they're the ones who aren't networking properly. They're not, and interestingly, they're not putting the deposit in the emotional bank account for me in the first place. And it's what you said there about being, the personal brand, not just being superficial. That's the superficial brand coming apart
indeed.
where we're not really seeing the real person. They're doing what they need to do, which is just to make money in that short term or solve a problem for themselves.
You know, I think that when you're looking at establishing a network that you see as an asset in your life, just like all of us want to, build wealth, or you want to
Mm.
deposit money into bank accounts, your network to me is an asset. And that's why you've got to think intentionally about it. I always say it's networking, not net sitting around. It does require some work. It's not something that happens by accident.
Yeah.
And I think the more intentional you get about, for example, I identified that there was a gap in my network of a certain caliber of kind of young entrepreneurs that I wanted to associate with. And I realized I didn't know many of them. And so I then sought out an organization called EO, Entrepreneurs
Mm.
Organization, and I joined EO because I realized that was the gap. And
Yeah.
I've been in EO now for 7 years, and
Wow.
I filled the gap through those relationships and networks I developed.
Wow.
But it didn't happen by accident. I had identified that gap in advance. And I think it's an important mindset to
Yeah.
approach your network thinking as a farmer and not as a hunter. Because I think a lot of people who've got a sales target to make, or maybe if you're a founder of a business,
Mm.
those transactional networks have their place where, you give something, someone else pays for that thing or
Mm.
whatever it is. But sometimes if you want those networks, especially if there's a value alignment, you want to grow those relationships. And that means, first of all, you've got to give. Giving generously is one of the best networking principles. And it,
Yeah.
it was interesting that when I did my research for the Networking for Introverts book, that concept made a lot of introverts a lot more comfortable with the process of networking,
Mm.
because a lot of people think it's about what can I get. Whereas if you approach every network thinking, what can I give? Then it makes a lot of people a lot more comfortable, because a lot of people are generous and they're prepared to
Yeah.
give. And you grow those relationships just like you were nurturing a plant. You water
Yeah.
them, you fertilize them, you see those people, and that it doesn't just happen by accident.
I love that. And there's a whole load of thoughts gone off my head there. And just you've just said so many great things which have just filled in some gaps for me, actually. Um, so many years ago, in fact, 2005, when I first started my own business, I remember joining many different business networks at the time and looking into networking. And one of the phrases that came up time and time again was "givers gain."
Mm.
And I think you've just triggered that thought for me again, which I've not thought of for many years. That actually that's the point of networking. And then when you connect that to what you said there about farming, not hunting, because I'm then thinking about I've got to sow the seeds, I've got to nurture, I've got to prepare the ground. And the phrase that would come out for that is reap what you sow. If you put the right effort in, you will reap the reward later, but you've got to
Mm.
do the effort. As you said earlier, you've got to dig your well before you run out of water.
Mm.
So the whole other thing. So
And
that's
it's
really,
not, it's never 50-50. It's not you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, because life doesn't work out like that. For example, if you are moving countries or you're moving jobs or you're moving towns, you will need a network much more in those transition times than if you were going about your normal kind of average, day in your life.
yeah,
So it's important that you've got to have those for those transition times in anticipation of the fact that things are going to change. I remember I was at a conference in Canada just before COVID,
okay.
and one of the guys said to me that he had been a victim of SOS networking, and he said
SOS,
that
okay.
where he'd become people had only heard from him when he was in trouble.
Okay,
Because
okay,
he had
okay.
he had joined a company and he was one of the last hires, and the company had financial difficulties, and so he was retrenched. And he just had his third child. They bought a bigger house, they bought a bigger car, and literally he was told, "You're going to be retrenched in 5 days." Which is a terrible situation for anyone to be in. And he said he realized with kind of the cold light of day that he had neglected his network, and he went through a list of the top 20 connectors. He went on to LinkedIn. He managed to find his old boss, and he managed to arrange a ticket at an event that his old boss was going to be at in the next 48 hours, and he managed to get another job through that connection. But he said
Mm,
he vowed after that he never wanted to be in that position again.
mm,
And
mm.
that's where he started that coffee strategy, of having one or two coffees a week. And he said because he always wanted to have a lot more invested in his relationships than
Yeah.
what he was extracting.
I love that. And what a realization for someone when they realized they'd been taking more out of that emotional bank account and not putting the deposits in. And it was in their time of need when they really needed it, when they're going to be retrenched
Yes.
in 5 days. So that realization comes to mind. I love that in terms of that thing there. And just going back to your point about EO, um, you must be the fourth or fifth person in the last 6 months who I've interviewed on this podcast who are members of EO, ranging from Vern Harnish originally to Rich Mulholland, Mo Fathelbab, yourself. It's one of these things that keeps coming up. What is it about EO that's driven your need? Because you said you went out looking for younger entrepreneurs to work with, to look at that, to fill your network, but you've stayed for 7 years. So it does more than that for you. I wonder, I know it's a slight sidetrack, but what is it about EO that's kept you there for 7 years?
I think when you're an entrepreneur, you often are quite unusual, compared to some of my friends or some of, because you're prepared to take big risks.
Yeah.
So in EO, I found my tribe. I always say when a network works, it becomes a tribe. And for me, EO, they are my people. When I go to events, we're all little clones of each other, and we're all big enthusiasts, and we've all started stuff. We've all created businesses out of nothing,
Yeah.
and I just love that creativity, the chutzpah, the
Mm,
spirit of being an entrepreneur. So
love
Rich
that.
Mulholland and I, in fact, are in Forum together. So, because the EO is built around forums, so you
Yes.
have almost like a board of advisors,
Uh,
um, that because and the other premise that I think EO gets very right is that it's lonely sometimes to be an entrepreneur, especially when things are not going right in your business or in your life, because and they say you often can't speak to your spouse or your partner because you don't want to freak them out, and you can't speak to your staff because you also don't want to freak them out, and so in Forum and in the EO tribe,
mm,
you've
mm.
got people who understand what it's like and that you can go to and get experience shares about what you know they've been through.
Yeah, so powerful. I met a gentleman called named Mo Fathabab last August, and he was one of the originators of that forum concept with Vern 20, 30 years ago. And he told me the story there quite emotionally about how that forum held people together and really enabled people to connect at a deeper level, which is what you've just articulated there. Things you can't tell your husband or your wife or your partner about, but you or your employees, but you've got something there as a group that form brings you together. So it's really interesting to hear that message coming out again. So thank you for that. Really powerful. Let's just delve back in. One thing again, another realization that's gone off for me. Your book, Networking for Introverts. I'm now seeing that as that's aimed at extroverts who don't know how to network properly. And it's really interesting when I just had that realization because we extroverts need to network like an introvert to make that work.
Yes, yes.
So interesting how that's just that realization has come out. Whereas when I read the book and read it face value, I saw the cover as being, hey, if I'm an introvert, I need to read this book to learn how to network. But I should just have that realization. It's network like an introvert because that's how you do best. Is almost that messaging for me.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the introverts who've bought the book
Yeah.
have then passed it on to their extrovert colleagues or their spouses or
Yeah.
team members because they say, this is how, first of all, you need to understand me because there's a lot of, insight into how the brain of an introvert works. And
Okay.
secondly, they say that there's some value in here because in many ways it was designed to be for introverts, but it also is the playbook for how to network.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. That's so I'm just hearing that exactly that. I love that. And I wish I'd had that book in 2020, sorry, 2004 when I set up my business. I could have done a lot more with it 21 years ago. So thank you for that. If you could only have gone back in time and done that for me. So you mentioned something there about how the brain works. And we talked about this yesterday. I'd love to just delve into that because you said something to me yesterday, which just it opened my eyes up to a little bit of difference there. So could you just go into a bit of the science behind this before we move on? Because I think this is really
Yes.
powerful.
So introverts and extroverts have fundamentally different neuroscience happening in their brain. So let's look at dopamine, for example. So dopamine is our feel-good chemical in our brain. It's what keeps us addicted to social media. Whenever anyone likes or shares your post, or when someone gives you a compliment, you get a little dopamine rush.
Yeah.
So it's a highly addictive chemical for us as human beings. We want more of it. So when they did MRI scans of introvert and extrovert brains, they found that introverts have got more dopamine receptors in their brains. So that means if you imagine a cup full of dopamine, when an introvert arrives at an event, their dopamine cup is already quite full. So that means, if they arrive and it's 6 8s already full, they've only got another 2 8s to fill up their cup. Whereas
Okay.
extroverts have actually got less dopamine receptors in their brain. And that means if I arrive at an event or you do, Phil, we've
Mm,
only got maybe 2 8s of our cup full of dopamine. And we need to, if you want to feel satisfied and fulfilled at the end of the evening, we've got to fill up our dopamine cup by another 6/8, which means that we need a lot of social interaction to fill up that cup. Whereas introverts don't need that because they've only got a small amount of bandwidth. And when I was researching this part of the book, my husband and I actually went to a party and we did a very social week. And he's an introvert and I'm an extrovert. And I could see at the beginning of the event, he'd already had enough. He actually didn't want to go. And he kind of was giving me the, kind of slicing of the neck thing. He wanted to go home. And he spoke, I think, to one or two people. And then he said to me, I'm going to go home. And prior to me knowing this neuroscience piece of research, I would have been annoyed with him for leaving me at the party. And that, I said, like, can't you just put in an effort? And I realized then it actually wasn't a choice. It is his brain was literally full. Yeah. And that was a big epiphany for me. He ended up going home. I ended up staying at the party because I needed my dopamine cup to be filled and I had a great time. So for me, it was and I think that one of the reasons for me writing the book was to actually get extroverts to understand the introvert brain also better, and that it's not a choice. You can't say to the person, oh, come on, just make an effort and, come out with us. Sometimes they literally cannot. Their brain is literally full.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Just hearing you say that, I've just run a workshop this morning and we've been talking about people's traits. And I used the phrase fundamental attribution error, talking about how people perceive others based on their own experience of the world. And we judge others based on our own experience of the world. So what you've just said there links into that, how fundamental attribution error fits in, that your husband had that brain that was already full and he had been out networking all week. In fact, didn't call it out, he'd just been out all week. He was full already. He didn't need that. So from a scientific point of view, his dopamine receptors were full and therefore he couldn't take anymore, literally. Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting, whereas in the past you would have looked at it and say, come on, you need to stay out and just put the extra effort in. But actually now you recognize that in him. So it's what a fascinating view on how we could get a different perception of individuals by understanding that science behind it.
It's and that equally applies around introverts and extroverts needing more downtime, because introverts need more downtime to let them process things. That's how their brain operates. And then they're ready to rock and roll. But if their brain is overstimulated, it actually makes them feel quite anxious. Whereas extroverts are energized by the social interaction because they have less dopamine receptors. Yeah. So for me, that was a big epiphany in terms of the way in which I manage myself and also, manage my relationships with both introverts and extroverts, and to respect those boundaries and to respect the neuroscience.
Yeah. So this is interesting, isn't it? Because the other book you've written is around mindfulness. And when I first met you, I couldn't understand the link between the two. And again, that light bulb's now going off in the sense I can see that connection. So we can just switch a bit from the networking aspect and how mindfulness helps, because there's a real power in there, I'm just hearing. And one thing, you often mention is, the greatest gift you can give anyone is your attention. And you said this earlier about listening being the most powerful thing. So tell me about mindfulness and how this connects to this networking and the introversion, extroversion view of the world.
So I think if you connect with people mindfully, which means you give them the full gift of your attention, you will always have deeper connections with that person. So when you network mindfully and you build a powerful personal brand mindfully, then it's much more authentic, real, deeper, and sustainable than if you were approaching it, in a kind of multitasking way. One of the biggest epiphanies for me around mindfulness and building relationships specifically is that no one can multitask. I actually got a job when I was younger because they said I'm a great multitasker, and I actually used that as I thought that was a badge of honor. But actually, your brain is a single processing unit. It's designed to do one thing well at a time. And that's why we're so tired, at the end of a day, because we've been constantly task switching. You're busy, you may be listening to this podcast, but you're doing your email, you're answering WhatsApp calls, and our brain, it takes us kind of 8 to 11 minutes every time you task switch to come back to the original task. And that makes us anxious, and it actually keeps us in quite a shallow level of thinking. It's not good for deep thinking. And I think we can all agree that the place in which we find ourselves in the world, deep thinking is required. If you want to develop a good network, you've got to think deeply about it. Where are the gaps? What's the next level of my career? How do I dig this well before it's empty?
I love that. And there's a whole load of things again, Helen. This is fascinating in terms of what you're talking there is about no one can multitask. And we have talked about that over the last few years. That's something that's become more prevalent. And interestingly, if I think back to when I graduated back in the early 90s, I'd go on to job interviews and they'd be give you lots of things to manage. And one of them was and it seems really funny when I think about it now, it was like a filing tray exercise where you had to look at how to manage lots of incoming demands and look at how you'd prioritize those things. And it was about looking at how to manage it. But actually what I'm hearing now is actually it's about focusing on that one thing and dealing with other things, but reprioritizing each time to say, right, this is the thing that has to be focused on. Let's get that done and move on to the next. Whereas we've become accustomed over the years to doing lots of things. And I think about myself being guilty. I'm just thinking now, I'll often watch an educational YouTube channel whilst I'm riding my spin bike in the mornings, because I can watch what's going on, learn something, and exercise at the same time. And I think I do it really well, but maybe I'm not doing it. Maybe I need to focus on the exercise or the learning and don't do the two at the same once. Maybe that's something I need to consider.
I think, I listen to podcasts when I go out and walk and when I exercise in the gym, because I feel that those are kind of, one is a cerebral task and the other one is physical. So whereas if you're doing multiple cerebral tasks and a task switch in that regard, I think that's when your brain gets really tired.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So in that case, I can continue riding my spin bike or walking the dog while listening to a podcast. That's okay. If you're listening to this now, walking, keep listening. I think that's the key point. So there's something there in that case around this mindfulness, and it's about, you said, I think, a couple of things. It's mindful networking. It's being mindful and paying attention to the individual in front of you. And I think, again, mindfulness is another one of these words that we've all learned about over the last 15 to 20 years, maybe, or maybe 5 to 10 years even. And that was about being present. And I'm now interpreting what you're saying there as being present to the individual in front of you, to be mindful of that conversation.
Well, I mean, you know what it's like if you're trying to speak to someone and they are constantly taking calls. Or if you're at an event and the person is on their phone the whole time. I mean, I'm not sure if you've ever seen that Simon Sinek clip where he has an example of two people sitting across a table and they've got their phone there, but it's actually off and it's turned upside down. But he speaks about how the quality of the interaction immediately decreases just by having the phone on the table. So it's not even on. He says that if you really want to build proper, meaningful, deep relationships with people, then you take your phone and you put it in your pocket, put it in your bag, or put it off the table. And you notice immediately by doing that. When I saw that clip, because often I would keep my phone, even though it was off at a meeting next to me, and just by taking it off the table, you saying to that person, you are the most important person that I'm currently meeting with. And that is a very powerful thing. And I do believe that one of our future-proofing skills for us as human beings is going to be the difference between people who can pay attention and people who can't, because our attention is being yanked around by, social media, by, different emails. And if you're constantly on all the time, that's why no one's sleeping anymore. Because, one of the things that I heard, and I heard that just before COVID, is you can't be brave if you're not well. And a lot of the things that, I'm talking about around your brand and about getting out and networking with new people, it makes a lot of people feel anxious. And so your well-being is actually the basis of the personal branding and networking pyramid, because your brain will actually be in fight and flight mode if, for example, you've only slept 5 or 6 hours the night before, and that's what a lot of people are doing. So if you're not waking up feeling rested, then a lot of these skills are not going to be possible, because your brain actually won't go there, because it's not in a conducive state to be pressurized. All you want to do is eat carbs and you want to just survive the day, which is not a great high performance mentality.
No, I think this is really powerful, isn't it? And there's been a big move over that. You think about the book from Matt Walker, Why We Sleep, many years ago, or a few years ago now. I think this has changed people's views on it, but there are still those people who think they can get by with little sleep. And I think sometimes the pressure of the work does demand that. But I also believe it's because people aren't prioritizing that health and fitness side of their life, in which sleep is a big part. And the bit you've just mentioned there is really key, isn't it? If you're getting less than 7 hours sleep, actually your brain can't process that information. Actually, it's that cerebral content going on again. We're not able to relax in the same way. Therefore, we can't do our best when we come to work or into any interaction in the future, which might be a mindful networking conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
So really, really interesting. So let's think about this in terms of purpose. And let's come back to what you said just now about your purpose is to teach. Because I think what you've done on this last 30 minutes of podcast is teach listeners of this podcast lots of different content, lots of things they could think about. And the bit that I love at the beginning, we talked about, uncovering your purpose and then unlocking that in terms of your secret sauce, because that becomes your personal brand.
Yes.
And you've just mentioned about a branding pyramid. I'd love just to connect those two up in terms of what's the branding pyramid you mentioned there, and how can that help business owners or leaders doing what they do?
So I think personal branding is largely around clarity. So the personal branding pyramid is about you gaining clarity about the brand of you, Pty Limited. What exactly is that? Not a fuzzy, if any of you remember taking a photo with a old-fashioned camera lens, where you were actually focusing the lens, and you were going, and I think that's our personal branding journey. It's getting laser sharp focus as to what that looks like. So step number one in the personal branding pyramid is I always encourage a lot of people to do an energy audit, because especially if you are good at a lot of things, your energy is actually giving you that North Star, it's setting you in the right direction. And I'll give you an example. So in my accounting career, because of my background, I'd have to do the VAT return for our business. And I would procrastinate about it. I would put it off. I could do it, but I didn't like doing it. And at the end of it, I would feel absolutely exhausted.
Yeah.
So from an energy audit perspective, because often we get caught up in the things that we can do, whereas there's a difference between the things you can do and in strategic coach, they call it your unique ability.
Yeah.
And for me, that distinguishing, so is this a 7 or 8 out of, from an energy perspective, or is it a 2 or 3? And if you do that, like for a week or two in your career, you'll really start to see what are the activities that are sending you in this direction. Secondly, to do a Gallup strengths profile, some kind of strengths finder. And that leads then to this. And also I always encourage people to ask 6 people around you. Say to them, I'm going through a personal branding exercise. If you had to describe me in one word, what would that word be? Because the other people often see your secret sauce before you do.
Yeah.
Because it's so part of us. It's only when someone says, wow, Phil, you do that so quickly, it would have taken me 3 days to do what you did in half a day. That's when you know that's probably part of your secret sauce. So for me, those are the pyramid, kind of clarity inducing activities. And then at the bottom of it is your well-being, because all of those things require you to be brave and to step out of comfort zones.
Yeah. And that's really interesting, isn't it? That thing about I love that, what you said there, well-being, stepping out your comfort zone, because if you've got that mental attitude, you can push yourself forwards. And the bit about, doing Gallup strengths, Clifton strengths, to give you a great, I say Clifton strengths for the other, the Gallup strengths gives you an opportunity to understand, who you are and identify what those top 5 strengths are. And you look at those 34 over time. You've then got a language to talk about, so you can then understand yourself better. But I love that point you've mentioned there about doing that audit, asking 6 people to describe me, because they see me more than I see me. That Johari window piece on people, looking internally, you can see stuff about me that I'm blind to. Yes. And I think that's really interesting, or maybe not blind to, but just not cognizant of at that time.
And also I think stuff that we're good at, we just think other people are good at it too. And it's only when other people point it out that actually not everyone is as good at that as you are.
I think that's,
I think that's very valuable feedback. So
yeah,
almost do a quick 360-degree feedback exercise on your personal brand and choose a variety of people. Choose a boss, choose a colleague, choose those 6 people quite well.
yeah, yeah. Well, I love that. Okay. So let's come back here. There's so much to talk about here. You've opened up another 25 episodes we can talk about here. But let's think about this in terms of you and what you found, because you discovered that purpose to teach. You realized that you came from a household where teaching was part of what you did. You realized that you love speaking at events and conferences. That's where you got into. So you've been doing this. But when did that realization come out for you? Because one thing you said just there about finding your base of the pyramid, but when did you suddenly realize you had this gift? Because you went to an accountancy, but you probably knew it before then.
Yeah, I don't think there was one specific moment. I do have those moments now in my 40s and 50s. I think that I got really clear probably from about 40.
Okay. Okay.
So it's really only been in the last 15 years. Before that, I was doing a lot of things that I didn't like doing that I could do, but
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily, they weren't in my unique ability quadrant.
Okay.
There were things that, if I had to rate my energy levels, there would be a 5 or a 6 out of 10. And I think that's pretty normal, in terms of what I observe with other people. But I do think what's exciting is you can advance that and you can actually make it happen quicker
Yeah.
because it's going to bring you more fulfillment in your life. Because the longer you spend in that very average zone where your energy is 4 out of 10, that's when you're in that space where you don't want to get out of bed every morning. You're dreading, work on a Monday.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, we spend so much time at work, we deserve to be fulfilling our purpose
Yeah.
throughout.
Yeah. And interesting, isn't it? Because I think a lot of people I've seen over 20 years of coaching and training and working with teams is that some of those people have that mindset of blaming others for those problems. Whereas
Yeah.
the light bulb, I think, for me, that goes on is that people need to wake up and they need to take that control themselves. Because often it's because we're not working in our energy, we're not working in flow. Um, we don't feel right, and therefore we're blaming the business rather than looking internally to say, okay, where am I not doing what I should be doing? Where am I not working in the way I want to be working, or I'm best at working? And
Yeah.
that almost is that comes back to that base of the pyramid. I guess this is what I'm thinking. That base of the pyramid gives you that confidence to step out of your comfort zone. And just because we've always done it doesn't mean we need to always do it. Does that
Yeah,
feel?
yes, I agree completely. And I think in addition to that, I would also add a mentality or a mindset that's been very helpful to me has been to realize that no one is coming. No one is coming to rescue you. You
Yeah,
know, we have it as a theme of our leadership development work because I've realized people spend a lot of time as people in waiting. They wait for bosses to recognize their skills. They wait for partners to pick them. And when you realize that no one is coming to save you, then there's a great degree of personal responsibility. And I think that's exciting and energizing. A lot of people get traumatized or kind of they get a bit scared about that. In fact, my 81-year-old mom, I said to her, we teach people that no one is coming. And she said, I can't believe anyone pays you to tell you that, Helen. She says, I wouldn't pay you 5 cents. She's very depressing. So I said, Mom, but that generation, I think, would wait. I think they were a lot more patient. Whereas
yeah,
I believe when you take individual responsibility for your life, your network, your career, your health, your mindfulness, and this is what adulting is about. No one's going to say, stop watching Netflix, for 7 hours every day, go and learn about AI or, get on your bike or,
yeah, yeah,
whatever it is. People are not going to tell us that. We've got to realize that we are the ones we've been waiting for. And there's an element of excitement and there's an element of scariness around that.
yeah.
But I think that it's exciting.
Yeah, I love that. We are the ones that we've been waiting for, you said there. And you used another phrase which I've heard. It's what adulting is about. And I think this is really interesting. As a father of a 19-year-old and a 22-year-old, stepping into that world from being kids to teenagers to adults, and they need to find their own way.
Yeah,
We can spoon feed them in their early days, but actually we've got to let them fly. And that's the key to what you've just said there, I'm hearing, is no one's coming to rescue you. It's up to you now. And you
yeah,
can't, and therefore you can't blame others for being stuck in the same place. If you haven't realized that you're an adult now, you need to make your own steps and make your own life.
exactly.
I think that's really, really powerful. And I wonder, think about your 81-year-old mother here, actually, in that case. You talked to me the other day about that South African mindset. You've talked to us about yesterday around where the world is today in terms of what's going on in the world about this resilience. But I wonder whether I'm thinking, is there a South African mindset, which is what you were talking about yesterday, that gives you that, hey, we've got to get on with it ourselves. No one's going to
Yeah,
fix it. Whereas in
yeah.
Britain, we do rely on the government a lot. We rely on the state for our pension. We rely on the state for our healthcare. We often rely on the state for, bailing our businesses out. All of these things. I wonder if there's a difference there that drives that South African mindset to some of the British mindset. And again, all those British listeners out there, I'm not getting it. I'm just thinking of the differences here.
Well, I think, we have very low expectations of government in any shape or form.
Mm,
So, when you don't have any expectations, in other words, if you don't do it, then it's not going to get done. I mean, I pay a gardening service to go and weed the pavements in our road.
well,
I don't have to do that. I don't tell anyone I'm doing it. Any of my neighbors, none of them know it, but miraculously gets done because it irritates me. And I have no expectation that our municipality is going to be coming to do it. So I
yeah.
think there is a mindset in South Africa, and I think it is our superpower in the
Mm,
sense that they say a boer maak 'n plan, which means a farmer makes a plan. And I have a life philosophy as an entrepreneur. You can't accept no as
mm,
a and you've got to go and sort out stuff. So those two, that combination, I think makes for a
yeah.
potent entrepreneur because you just have no other expectations. Our government is not going to help you. They are, they're just not capable, and they don't want to either. So, then you've just got to make a plan, and
Yeah.
that's what we do. So, it's interesting to watch, a lot of the political and economic turmoil going on around the world
Mm,
is, I think the South Africans are grit because we've also been through a lot of political upheaval over the last, 50, 60 years.
yeah.
So there's a stronger sense of individual responsibility where no one's going to help us. We've got to help ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that. No one's going to help us. We've got to help ourselves. And I think that drives that business mentality. And there, think about you said about the EO forums and the networks that we've bonded. Those are people, when you said you found your tribe, I think those are people who are also in that same mindset of we've got to do
Mm.
this ourselves. No one's going to make it different for us. And we do need in the world that entrepreneurial mindset because otherwise the world stays the way it is. We need those billion people to push and challenge the norms and be that innovator, as Steve Jobs talked about in the advert many years ago about pushing, and they're the disruptors. Um, and interestingly, that mindset you've got there is about something different as well, isn't it? Because you paying a gardener to go and weed the road, you're doing that for a reason, but you're not doing it for thanks, I don't think.
No, 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 I have no expectation of things. You're one of the few people that I've just said it now that, my husband knows that I do that,
Mm.
and I do that. I don't tell anyone else because that's not why I do it.
Yeah,
But I think that, the mentality that no one is coming has been a big driving force around that,
yeah,
is
yeah.
we just have no expectations.
Yeah, I love that. And interesting actually from a business perspective, with what's going on in 2025, we do all need to find our own way. We need to switch off from that global disruption and say, okay, how do we drive our businesses forwards? But how do we build better networks in doing that as well? And I think that there's a common thread here again, that network that's carried you forwards by being mindful about connecting with individuals and building something together through the EO forums, through your own networking, is about building something that's bigger than you, and actually that supports everybody together as well. So it's nobody's coming for you, but you've got to find your own path by doing
Yes,
all of those
yes.
things, which I love that.
And I also, I'm very conscious of the people that I have coffee and associate with because I think that, you've got to realize your energy is finite. And I don't want to be around people who moan and groan. It's
Yeah,
easy to complain. It's less easy to do something about it. And I try and only have coffees and clients and people around me because I think you've got to guard your energy very fiercely. I think you've got to be very aware of your consumption with social
yeah,
media. I
yeah,
think you have to be very aware of your consumption of the news. A friend of mine said to me, her desire to be well informed is currently at odds with her desire for her well-being. And I think we want to know what's going on, but you've almost got to keep it at a distance because it can be very all-consuming.
Yeah.
And and really there's a lot of stuff we can't do anything about, but you can control you.
Yeah.
And that's, I think that self-management is just key especially in, big changes and big uncertain times that we're living in at the moment.
And I think that's really key, isn't it? When you think about that circle of control and circle of influence, that there's certain things out there which we can't control. But we have to look at how we take responsibility for our own business and our own lives within that. Therefore, we've got to do something about it, but actually we can't control it. So it's almost disassociating the two and looking at what can we do to improve our own future and the future of the people who choose to work with us as well.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's really, really powerful and interesting. We're not going to have time to talk about this now, but I think this also leads me to the conversation we had yesterday around that victim mentality that everything's done to me, whereas we need to step out of that to build our business and about creating that responsibility for ourselves to build our networks, build our businesses, build the forums around us, and actually recognize our own personal brand and how that fits into the world, because we only light people up when we're on fire ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, misery loves company, and I think energy attracts you attract a kind of energy when you are, in your best space.
Yeah.
And I do think that's almost our responsibility and our need as human beings.
Yeah.
Because when you start fulfilling your purpose and you are doing stuff that you know that you're good at, and you're also making a contribution, because purpose always means that we're contributing something to the world. And we're approaching the world with that open palm. What can I give, not what can I get? Then really amazing stuff starts to happen. I've witnessed it personally. I'm sure everyone who's listening or watching this, you've seen it happen in your life.
Do you know, and interesting, if I think about the reason we called this Sparks was we wanted to, when we created this back in late 2019, we wanted to build a podcast, which was originally a marketing tool, but actually it became more of a communication tool to help other people step up. And we wanted to spark people's imagination, to spark people's creativity, to spark people's responsibility, to spark people's inspiration. It was about igniting that fire that people sometimes have neglected and they've relied on other people to do. So we want to really try and build that community and using your word there, that tribe. And interestingly, I talk about a purpose above and beyond making money. Because if I look at my wall across me, I've got the 17 UN sustainability goals looking at me in the face. And whether you believe in those or not, there's lots in there which is really powerful to help businesses become a force for good and actually the individuals within those businesses. So I love what you're saying there about contribution and purpose. It so resonates for me, and I get quite passionate about that. So that's an area of passion for me. But if we can educate more people, we can help other people step up and do things differently, and that's the mission that we're on.
And I think the dark side of that is that if you don't have clarity about your purpose or your personal brand, then other people impose their clarity on you. And then that's often when I meet people in their 40s or 50s where they are living careers that they're not happy in, but they're relatively good at it. Otherwise, it wouldn't have stayed, been kept on.
Yeah.
And it's because their lack of clarity that they didn't have earlier on in their career has now almost come and bitten them because and that is what happens, because if you don't have clarity, other people will impose their clarity on you. And then you end up living a career that you feel just is unfulfilling and not filling, or fulfilling your purpose.
And this is really interesting, actually. I'm just coming up to 55 this year, and I graduated in 1993, so however many years ago that is now. And a number of our friends are coming up to what they're calling retirement, which is the standard thing you do when you've been in a corporate job. And some of my friends have been in that same job for life. They've never changed. And I'm not saying they're unfulfilled, but I've sought variety over my time, which is interesting on our original conversation. But I've now done this role since 2004, running a business on my own, building a team, building a network, and creating something that's bigger than me. And I do think there's something there about people settling for what they believe is the right thing, as opposed to settling for what they believe they want to be doing. And that's not a judgment, that's just a recognition, I think, in some ways, when you get to that age in life and you think, okay, what's next? For me, I'm continuing to do this because I love doing it and I believe we can inspire. And that's what I'm hearing from you as well, that that inspiration comes from your purpose.
And I think if you adopt a playful, curious approach to purpose without it being heavy and, you just start learning new things. For example, my husband and I are busy learning how to dance at the moment. And we are very bad dancers, and I have to tell you, we have not improved greatly. But it's part of, first of all, I've deliberately chosen something that we're not good at, because as we get older, I'm also 55 this year, and as we get older, we often only do things that we're good at. And that's not where your brain starts to spark, because you literally want it to light up in areas that it's not used to. So, and I'm learning how to crochet. And I knit every night, and I find it very therapeutic. But crocheting has really almost brought me to my knees, because I'm very badly coordinated, and the crocheting has been very hard, but I'm persevering. So, that ability to take on to be in a beginner's mindset, I think is very powerful, especially as we get older, because otherwise I think, nothing interesting happens in comfort zones.
And I love that. And essentially, if I was listening to a podcast yesterday morning whilst on my bike, and they had the acronym Neuro. And that acronym, when I looked at it, was about understanding the process you need to go through to improve yourself as you get through life effectively. And one of those was around learning a new skill. Learning that and pushing yourself out of your comfort zone to learn something different every day. And they called it optimize, which was the O from neuro. But I really like that as an approach. Learning to dance is on my list actually as well as learning to sing. And if you heard me sing, you think that's going to be a long way off before I learn to sing.
But it's brave, and I think it's great. And it doesn't matter how good or bad you are, the fact we're participating.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yes, I'll tell you how well it goes when the people have walked out the room later. Helen, look, we said we speak for 45 minutes. We've gone on for longer than that, and I appreciate your time actually as well. This has been fascinating for me. Lots of great avenues of conversation there, and I'd love to go deeper on some of those things at some stage in the future. If you were to leave guests with a nugget above and beyond what you've already done, because you've left so many nuggets already, what would you say is the main thing you would tell the younger Helen that you've learned over this last 54 and a bit years? What would you tell the younger Helen that would help her develop to where you are now and beyond?
So Maya Angelou has that wonderful quote, "People show themselves to you the first time, believe them." And I think that I wish I'd learned that earlier, in terms of, networks work when there's an alignment of value systems. And there were people that I met earlier on in my career we didn't share value systems. And I think I would have been more clear around my brand and their brand and what was important to them. And it would have saved, a lot of angst actually. So I wish I'd known that earlier.
Lovely. I love that. And Maya Angelou, she has some amazing quotes that come up regularly actually. So I love that in terms of that, and just believe that what you heard originally. So thank you. Where would people go finding the Helen Nicholson we're talking to now? Where would we go looking?
So you can buy any of my books on Amazon.
Yeah.
And they are available on Spotify as audible books.
Okay.
And they want to follow me or at Network with Helen on Instagram, Helen Nicholson on LinkedIn, and my website is helen-nicholson.com, and it's Nicholson CH.
Brilliant. And we'll put that all in the show notes as well, which Amanda will write up later on. So thank you. Helen, thank you. I've learned a load of stuff here. So thank you. I've got reams of notes. And as you said at the beginning, your purpose is to teach, and you've taught me a lot of things I hadn't thought about before. So thank you for that. It's been a privilege to talk to you. Thank you. And I hope to do it again at some stage when the next book comes out, if it does.
No, it's in progress.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting. Okay. Well, in that case, when it does, I didn't know you were writing another one. So that's great. Thank you. So thanks, Helen. Really appreciate it.
It's been such a treat. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Often when I speak to a new guest on this show, we talk about the things we're going to talk about the day before. In fact, we do that all the time. We talk about what's going to be on the show. And I always say we're going to follow the energy. And I think when you listen to this next podcast with Helen Nicholson, you realize there's such a high energy. Helen is full of inspiration. Her message is around teaching, but actually she teaches so many things on this podcast, which I believe you can inspire yourself with and go and implement in your business and in your life straight away. Thinking about the tools she talks about around building the network and being intentional. Think about your personal brand. Think about how you build that brand and ask the 6 people around you what they think of you and what their brand is, because they know it up front. The messages I hear from her around taking personal responsibility and that mindset from a South African lady who's really lived what she believes in, and talking about what the South African mindset is around actually, you've got to take responsibility because nobody's going to do it for you. So listen out as you listen to Helen Nicholson now. Hear the messages, understand what you can do with it, and as always, go and act on it. Take advantage of the messages she puts there and go and buy the book, Networking for Introverts. And remember, I realize it's not for introverts after all. It's for all of us. Enjoy the show. And as always, please drop me a note of your comments and questions when you've been through it. And I say, I can't hold you accountable, but I'd love you to learn from this because our message in Sparks by Ignium is about helping you empower your lives. And we just want to inspire one of you to do something different because that will in turn change the world. Good luck. Enjoy the show. Here's Helen Nicholson.